In this video, we are looking at the new Sigma Art 17-40. We're also doing a light comparison with the classic 18-35 and Sigma's 18-50 f2.8 contemporary. I had actually thought about doing a completely different video at first, just throwing in a couple of random side-by-sides just for fun. But the more I actually used the 17-40, the more I realized that maybe this old 1835 isn't as obsolete as I thought, and in fact, maybe it's even a better option for some people. I'm not saying everyone, but for some people, maybe even including me, than the newer 17-40. So let's dive in. Let's see what Sigma did to create the new 17-40. What makes it better, what makes it the same, and what makes it worse. For those of you interested, all the sample footage in this video was shot on the Sony FX30, but it's also available for Nikon Z, Fuji X, Canon RF, lo and behold, and even L-mount, which I'm not sure there's any APS-C L-mount cameras on the market. If we start with a side-by-side, there's some obvious differences. The 17-40 is modern, it's punchier, we're getting that same crisp, micro-contrasty look we're seeing on pretty much all the newer Sigma Art series lenses. The 18-35 still looks pretty excellent. It renders a bit smoother in comparison. We're not getting that same level of punch or micro contrast, which actually can be a bit more flattering if you're shooting portraits or if you're using these lenses for interviews. So they're both nice and sharp, but we're definitely seeing more of that kind of modern pop on the 17-40. Now, let's look at some build or engineering differences. A constant f1.8 zoom is still somewhat of a technical marvel. I mean, how many of them are there really out there? So if we look at them side by side, especially if we turn them around and look at the size of the exit pupils, which by the way is just a fancy word for rear element, we can see the amount of brute optical force it took back in 2013 to actually pull this off. On the 18-35, we're getting more optical corrections inside the lens, while the 17-40 relies more on in-camera corrections, which becomes very obvious if we put these two on a full-frame camera. The smaller and more lightweight 17-40 got a smaller image circle, but we're also getting a noticeable amount of distortion. If we look at the 18-35, image circle is bigger and the railing looks a lot less distorted. So keep this in mind if you're doing architecture or if you're planning on using this for real estate in areas like kitchens where there's usually a lot of vertical and horizontal lines. Now, moving on. The bigger image circle on the 18-35 actually makes it possible for us to get a decent full-frame coverage from about 28mm. And believe it or not, I've actually used this as a full-frame 35mm prime more than once, so it totally works and it makes this a more versatile lens for some shooters. Getting back to the 17-40, we're not getting rid of that vignetting since we're dealing with a smaller lens and a smaller image circle. So there's a lot of interesting things that kind of shows up when you start looking at these side by side. And I specifically remember when I was out shooting these distortion comparisons here, and I was thinking back to all the people who kind of poo-pooed the 18-35 for the amount of distortion we had on this lens. Well, turns out it's, at least compared to the 17-40, not that bad. And by the way, if you're worried about distortion, most lenses, including zoom lenses, will have, well, and these actually have two different types of distortion. On the wider end, you normally get tiny bit of barrel distortion, which is this type of distortion, and as you gradually zoom in, it shifts over to become pincushion distortion. There's not a lot of distortion on this lens, but there's always going to be some. If you're a still shooter, none of that will matter that much because you're relying on in-camera corrections and you got the lens profiles in your editing software like Lightroom and Capture One. But for us video shooters or hybrid shooters, we might actually be happier with the older 18-35 since we don't get in-camera corrections typically, and in cameras that do, it's typically preferred to turn those off as they can sometimes create some weird looking artifacts when they're stretching the image and there's some vertical or horizontal lines involved. Those lines can in turn make it more difficult if you want to stabilize the footage in post and create even more warpy, weird artifacts. So if your camera can add in-camera corrections for video, turn those off if you're having issues with post-digital stabilization. Now let's take a look at autofocus. The autofocus performance on the new 70-40 is pretty stellar, and keep in mind the autofocus settings on my camera are set to be quite slow. The autofocus motor is quiet as a mouse, which is more than we can say about the old 1835, which is kind of known for having a pretty noisy autofocus, which will get picked up by your camera's internal microphones. And maybe that's one of the reasons why so many of us got pretty good at manual focusing back in the early 2010s, and were also pretty early adopters of those wireless lavalier systems from Rode and other brands. I don't know, but it's kind of an interesting theory. Now on the 1835, I'm using the Sigma MC11 adapter because this here is a DSLR lens, so you will need some sort of adapter if you want to use this lens. Now, I would recommend going with the MC11 adapter, by far the best one when it comes to autofocus performance. In fact, I've not had any issues with autofocus performance or reliability when using this combination, to the point where personally I don't see a reason when it comes to autofocus performance at least to trade this in and get these 17-40. I trust the autofocus on this setup to the point where I don't see a reason to change anything for the sake of autofocus performance. They all have very controlled focus breathing, and none of these lenses, by the way, is parfocal, but the 70-40 actually keeps up surprisingly well if you're doing crash zooms with autofocus turned on. I didn't test this on the 1835, but I know it's not as fast as the 70-40. Okay, let's put this down and move from mechanical behavior to optical performance. There's a tiny bit of color fringing if you zoom in, but I don't think this is going to show up in any real world footage. None of the sample footage that I've shot for this video have shown any signs of longitudinal or latitudinal chromatic aberration, which is kind of what you'd expect if you're buying a lens from Sigma, right? Now, if we take a look at flaring, it's also very well controlled. We got a tiny bit of ghosting here, this little green ghost flare when we're shooting straight into the sun, but we're not losing any contrast. There's plenty of details in the shadow areas. We're also seeing just a tiny bit of that micro contrast here on this shot if we look at the guitar and how it's kind of separated out from the background, but also from the surroundings, which should be more or less or almost on the same focal plane. So plenty of texture and pop. Even if we move in closer, it's not looking digital. We're getting nice details here in the fabric. We can see the stitching and the perforations here at the back. So personally, I'm super happy with the optical performance here on the 17-40. If we were to look at the opposite and take a look at bokeh, so tasty. Okay, now we're at 40mm wide open at f1.8. Here we're getting some other interesting results comparing these two side by side. We're getting a nice sharp separation between our subject and the background. The micro contrast kind of carries into the background and makes it just a tiny bit busy compared to the 1835, which at least to my eyes on this shot here and a few other ones looks a bit smoother, a bit more natural and organic. And both of these are shot at 40 versus 35mm to get the maximum amount of compression and blurry background. Now a quick look here at the 18-50 at f2.8, zoomed all the way into 50mm. We're not getting the same amount of background blur, and there's a bit of added compression here at 50mm that gives the image a slightly flatter look. It's still looking very nice and smooth and all, but we're not getting the same type of subject separation obviously here at f2.8. Sigma has done a phenomenal job of just updating this classic and turned it into a modern mirrorless lens. With an aperture ring, we got function buttons, an iris lock, we got weather sealing, which is another huge deal in my opinion. The size and weight have also come down significantly. We're down from a 72mm filter thread here on the 1835 to a 67 on the 17-40, and we're also down from 810 grams to about 560. The autofocus is nice and quiet, but it is important to look at the tiny little differences and nuances beyond all the new and shiny things to figure out which one of these is actually going to be the best fit for you. So maybe you still prefer the old 1835, but you want something lighter. Possible workaround could be to get the smaller and more affordable 18-50 if you just want something smaller and more lightweight and comfortable for travel and more casual shooting, and still hang on to your old faithful 1835 or buy a new or used 1835. But if you want that new modern crisp look with that modern pop, then the 17-40 is obviously gonna be the ticket for you. Let me know what you think about the comparisons you've seen in this video and which one of these lenses that you prefer. I'm gonna put some links below to all the lenses we've talked about in this video, including the MC11 adapter, which I do recommend if you're planning on picking up an 1835. It is by far the best lens adapter when it comes to autofocus performance for this lens. Thank you so much for stopping by. I want to thank Sigma Nordic for sending out the 17-40 and the 18-50 to make this video happen. Goodbyes.